Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, they weren't quite states yet. They became states later. Arizona was the last one of the 48 states in the continental U.S. to join the Union, and that happened in 1912. So before that, the country was still being built. New Mexico was the same way, and Oklahoma at the time was Indian territory. It eventually became a state too. Now, I want to tell you some really interesting things. Oh, thank you. One of the things I want to tell you about is the population of the country was growing quite a bit at about 1900. You know, at the time, the top 5 states in the country that had the most people living in it were New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, and Missouri. Now, if you think about that, those 5 states I named also had the 5 biggest cities in the country at the time. New York, obviously, New York City. Pennsylvania had Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Illinois had Chicago. Ohio, well, we have Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Toledo, Dayton. Missouri, we had St. Louis. Approximately 9 million people immigrated from Europe into this country at about 1900, right at the turn of the 20th century. And that was within the first 10 years, from 1900 to 1910. Out of that 9 million people coming into this country, 70% of them came from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. Now this is kind of important, because when you start thinking about that, those countries, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, that's Italy, Greece, Germany, Poland, Hungary, Russia. Those are the people coming into this country. We're kind of getting away from back in the colonial days where most of the people were from England or Ireland. So we're getting a lot more people in this country. And this is where they start calling the United States the great melting pot of immigrants. In addition to all these new immigrants coming from Europe, what we also had happening was what they called the Great Migration. In the Deep South, you had all these blacks, African Americans, who have now won their freedom after the Civil War. Well, the Southerns, what they did is they imposed what they called Jim Crow. Jim Crow was laws to kind of hold back African Americans, keep them from being able to do things. So they were still living in the South in poverty and real poor, living on the farms. Well, now they have this freedom, and they want to get away from all this Jim Crow laws, so they started moving out of the South, out of the farms, and coming up to the North and into the bigger cities. New York City in particular had a very large growth of African Americans moving from the South into the city. About 7 million African Americans left the South between 1900 and 1930, just moving into the cities.
I noticed on the map there's no territory lines.
No territory lines? I'm not sure what you're meaning.
Like it doesn't, over here, it doesn't put the names on the things. And they're like,
And you can see some of the state lines. They're
Yeah.
real hard to see. It's just how it is on the projector. Okay. Well, I was going to go on. Everybody moving into the cities. You got African Americans coming in. You got immigrants coming in from Europe. The cities grow bigger and bigger. Now, we've always have had large cities like New York and Chicago. But now with more and more people, we have to have more room for them. And there's not enough room. So buildings started growing taller and taller. This is the time when skyscrapers first started coming about. Now, definition of skyscraper is any building taller than 40 stories or approximately 500 feet tall. At the time before this era, you had really tall buildings. They used to call skyscrapers anything taller than 10 stories. But the way that the buildings were built were brick and mortar. The higher you go, the more unstable it gets. Well, a new invention that came out in this time was steel. They took iron and forged it.
Carnegie was a big guy of steel.
I'm going to talk about Carnegie here in a minute. So with steel, stronger building materials, we can build the buildings taller and higher. So you start having New York City and Chicago and St. Louis being these first cities with skyscrapers. Now, you just mentioned Andrew Carnegie. Right there is Andrew Carnegie. He was born in Scotland, actually, and he immigrated to the United States. He was born in 1835. Now, he founded what was called the Pittsburgh Steel Company. How many of you guys are big Cincinnati Bengals fans? We going to win against Pittsburgh Steelers tomorrow?
That's right, yeah.
Well, Pittsburgh Steelers got their name because the city of Pittsburgh was founded with building steel industries. Carnegie had his base, Carnegie Steel Company, right there in Pittsburgh. Now, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about Carnegie. I'll let you guys look that up on your own. But I'm going to tell you a few things about him. At the time, he was worth about $480 million. That's a lot of money, even today. Now, you account for inflation and adjustment for over the years, that is worth about $310 billion today. When he sold his company, he ended up selling it to a guy named J.P. Morgan. And I'm going to talk a little bit about J.P. Morgan too. He ended up making millions of dollars and was able to retire. He had kind of a philosophy in life. He said you need to spend your life dividing it up into threes. The first third of your life, you need to learn as much education as you can. The second third of your life, you need to try to accumulate as much wealth as you can. The third third of your life is you take that wealth and you give it to the poor and give it to the needy. Because of that, he was committed to philanthropy. Philanthropy is giving out money. It's helping out the poor and everything. So, by the time he died, he actually gave away 90% of his wealth to buildings and education. I'm going to show you a few little things here. This is a typical steel mill right along the rivers. What they would do is they would take iron and forge it, burning carbon into it, and making iron ore stronger, making it steel. Of course, the way he did things, he was able to build one steel plant and build multiple other steel plants all throughout the East Coast and even into the Midwest. So Carnegie Steel became really popular. And I was talking about his philanthropy. What he ended up doing is he started giving out money to colleges and universities and schools, wanting people to become more educated. Going back to that first part of his philosophy, learning as much as you can. Because he did this, he built libraries all over the country. And he kind of had a standard blueprint of the library. They all look the same. There's one of these old Carnegie libraries here in Germantown. Anyone know where it is?
Historical Society.
That's correct, the Historical Society. If you go over into Miamisburg, there's a Carnegie Library in Miamisburg, right near the little park off of Central Avenue. You can find these buildings all over, and they look pretty much the exact same. Something else that Carnegie did, which was new and modern, is he sold stocks and bonds to his company. So he didn't own the company all himself. He would have other people buy and invest money into his company. And he maintained control of how it was managed. He would often hire other people to run the company, but he had control, and other people were buying money or buying parts of his company to help invest so he can go buy another steel plant. Now, another guy that was kind of with Carnegie did the same thing was John D. Rockefeller. Now, Rockefeller is an interesting character because Rockefeller and Carnegie had a little bit of a competition. They both wanted to know who is the richest. They also wanted to outdo each other and giving money away. Most people will turn around and say John D. Rockefeller was probably the richest person in the world in the history. Now, he was born in 1839. He founded the Cleveland Standard Oil Company in 1870. What he did is he noticed all the people at the end of the 19th century, right after the Civil War, how they were building their wealth. And a lot of it started with Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt would buy ships, boats, to get people around the country, up and down rivers, like the Ohio River, the Miami River, or even the Mississippi River. Well, that happened in about 1820s, 1830s, 40s. What he ends up noticing is new technologies coming out. People aren't going to ride boats to get around the country anymore. Boats are only limited to going through waterways. So the way that people are going to do it is by the locomotive, train. So Vanderbilt got rid of his boats and started investing in trains. Rockefeller noticed with trains, this is a machine. They need to have other things besides water and coal to make steam. You need to have oil to lubricate pistons. So he started buying up oil refineries. And then he started making deals with people like Vanderbilt where they would carry and transport his oil anywhere. And Rockefeller was able to make a lot of money. He actually became the first billionaire in the world by 1916. And by the time he was done, his total wealth equaled about 90%, his total wealth equaled about 1.5% all of the United States' total economy. He ended up owning so many oil companies, he had 90% of them in the country owned. That was a monopoly. Nobody else could buy oil without going through Rockefeller. And because of that, he actually kind of got in some trouble. Well, because he was in trouble and other people were trying to buy oil, he started looking for something else to get away. What he ended up doing is, with oil refineries, and one of the big things oil was used for at the time is for lights. We didn't have electricity at the time. We had oil burning lamps. So if you bought a lamp to light up your house, you had to buy oil from Rockefeller. Well, things started changing. So what Rockefeller did with refineries, they started kind of burning off the oil, and they had a byproduct left over. He didn't know what to do with this byproduct. A couple of things came out of it. Does anyone have an idea what the byproduct was? Gasoline. Rockefeller ended up refining gasoline and changing from just selling oil for kerosene lamps to changing the way engines are ran. Instead of running on steam engines, he started with the development of the combustion engine. Because of combustion engines, you can actually have a safer and a more practical use of a motor instead of steams, which can go further, longer. And it started replacing the steam engines, the steam locomotives of trains. New inventions started coming out, one of which was the automobile. At the time, the automobile was a pretty large piece of equipment and very expensive. It was a luxury item. Well, another guy I'm sure all of you have heard of, Henry Ford. Henry Ford basically said, hey, I don't think just the real rich people like Rockefeller and Carnegie should be able to have a car. I think everybody should be able to. He actually tried to patent a design on a car, and there was a monopoly on it. They basically told him he had to get permission from a company to be able to build a car. instead of start his own business. He took them to the Supreme Court, and they actually fought, and he won. After that, he founded the Ford Motor Company. And when he founded the Ford Motor Company, what he did is he changed the way things were done. He started implementing assembly line technology. Now, assembly lines weren't a new invention that Henry Ford invented himself, but he made it practical. He made it so that when you bought a car, or a car was being built, I should say, you had a couple people put the wheels on and it moved down the line. The next person puts the cab on. The next person puts the steering wheel on. So all the cars were built the same. They were mass produced. Now you all of a sudden you have a large supply of cars, and this is basic economics. And I'm not really here to teach about economics, but it's got supply and demand. There's a larger supply out there, so people could demand more of it. Because of that, he ended up lowering the cost of the automobile from thousands and thousands of dollars to about $850. That was pretty good. His first mass-produced car was the Model T. Now, going back a little, I was telling you how everybody was moving out of the country up into the cities. You have immigrants coming into the cities. This time changed things a lot. People weren't living on the farm anymore, growing their crops and tending their livestock for their livelihood. More and more people were working jobs. Because they were working jobs, instead of raising crops, they had more money and income. So they could go buy things like a car. So the old horse and buggy way of getting around town went away and people started buying more vehicles. John Pierpont Morgan, or J.P. Morgan was known as. Again, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about some of these people. I'm kind of running through these. But Morgan was a banker. And not only was he a banker, he was an investor. He would look at people like Rockefeller, at Carnegie, Thomas Edison, who I'm going to talk about too, and he would give them extra money to help them move along. And in return, they had to pay him back, a loan. And he made millions of dollars doing that. He was such a successful investor, you still hear about J.P. Morgan today. If you've ever heard of the bank, Chase Bank, that's actually owned by J.P. Morgan and Company. And the technical name of Chase is J.P. Morgan and Chase. Chase was another banker like Morgan. Now, one of the interesting things about Morgan is he actually bought Carnegie Steel from Andrew Carnegie. And when he did so, he changed the name from Carnegie Steel to U.S. Steel, making it sound more all-American. He also bought a lot of inventions from Thomas Edison, including the way Thomas Edison had electricity running. You had two competing forms of electricity, direct current and alternating current. Well, Morgan bought Edison's form of electricity, and he founded the company General Electric, which is still in existence today. And I was talking a little bit about Thomas Edison, and I'm making a brief comment. If any of you guys want to, kind of an extra thing, look up to see when the first light bulb came out. Talked about how Edison basically invented the electric light bulb. This was a new, cheap form of lighting up buildings, so we got away from the kerosene lamps. Not to mention, this was safer. If you had a kerosene lamp and it knocked over, you can have a house fire. You have a light bulb and it breaks, you just have some broken glass you have to sweep up. We still use electric lights today. There's nothing that's been replacing that. This was a marvel new technology at the time.
Jeremy, I'm sure you've seen it. Have you seen the documentary, The Men Who Built America?
Yes, I have.
It's fantastic. Yeah.
It's an excellent
So
series.
all these people, all those top five. It's on Netflix.
It was on the History Channel, and Netflix carries it now. Another person I wanted to talk about was Alexander Graham Bell. Again, he was a renowned inventor and scientist. He's most famously known for inventing the telephone. He first got the first telephone patent in 1875, a whole 25 years before the turn of the 20th century. He founded the Bell Telephone Company, and you can still find remnants of the Bell Telephone Company all around the country today. AT&T is what became the Bell Telephone Company. Interesting thing I found out about him is he made the first transcontinental telephone call in 1915. He called from New York City to San Francisco. Now what's really neat and really cool about the telephone with this, before the telephone, all you had was the telegraph. You know, you had a wire and you'd have to hit Morse code, type out a message, and it'd send. And then the person on the other end would have a little receiver, and that Morse code would dot, 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 dash, dash, and they'd have to basically transcribe it. Now the telephone, you don't have to do that. You can just pick up a phone receiver and talk into it, and the person on the other end can hear you. Now, it's kind of neat when you think about this because we're so used to this kind of technology. Heck, we've got nowadays cell phones. You know, I can turn around and call someone in England if I want, or Japan. So it's hard to get exciting about something like this, but this was exciting at that time. A little interesting thing about Alexander Graham Bell, when he invented the telephone, he didn't even like it. He thought it was the stupidest idea he had. It was probably his most successful. Well, I'm going to tell you one more person after him, and this guy, he took Alexander Graham Bell's telephone and went a step further with it. Don't even ask me to try to pronounce his first name, because I can't. But his last name is Marconi. What Marconi did is he studied electricity and radiation, and he studied the telephone and how it worked. And he figured out a way radio waves work. So he invented the first radio. He also invented, with the radio, the first wireless telegraph. What was interesting and great about this is now you can communicate long distances without having a cable from one end to the other. This really helped a lot of ships. In particular, one of the most famous ships was the Titanic. The Titanic had the new Marconi wireless telegraph system aboard it. So when the Titanic struck the iceberg in April of 1912, they sent out SOS messages through the Marconi telegram, the wireless telegram. That way it got back to England, over to New York, and it got other ships in the area to hear. The closest being the Carpathian, which was about 10 miles away from where the Titanic was sinking. This is what helped get information out. So this was huge. Now, going back to a little bit of a military history, you know, we're here in a military museum. Communications are enormous. How do you know if in the middle of a battle something's going on, you know? Before, what they did is they would have signals. They'd have signiform flags. They'd kind of wave a flag and tell you with the signals, the way they waved it, and what kind of flag, what was going on. Then they started using telegraphs. In the Civil War, the War Department, especially Abraham Lincoln's side, would get updates constantly in the war room, what was going on the battlefield. It was always said that Abraham Lincoln would sit in the war room waiting on pins and needles to hear the latest news of the latest battle. Now with the wireless telegraph, you have radio operators who can tell people what's going on. This is where walkie-talkies started coming out. Later in the future, after 1900s, closer to about 1960s and up into 1980s, we used this technology to help create cell phones. Now, another thing, this is probably one of my favorites because it's a local point, the Wright brothers. This is something that's hard to imagine, but the airplane first came out. A lot of it had to do with the combustion engine, being able to get enough speed to create lift. People have always been trying to fly pretty much as long as mankind's been around. In fact, there's a famous ancient Greek mythology, Icarus is what it was named. Icarus put wings on his arms to fly out of a prison cell, connected the wings with wax, and according to ancient Greek mythology, he flew so high up into the sky and got too close to the sun melted the wax, and the wings fell off his arms and he fell. Now, you've all probably seen some of those funny videos, people running and jumping off the roof of a house, trying to flap their arms with makeshift wings or things like that. Nothing worked. The Wright brothers from our own hometown, Dayton, were the first to develop the plane. First plane flew at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in December of 1903. What's really amazing to me, nobody thinks about, the airplane and the car came out close to about the same time. You know, the car was maybe 20, 30 years ahead of the airplane, but still within the same time, the same people's lifetime. We look at this technology today, and we take it almost for granted because it's been around for so long. We've had so many advances in it and how it's operated, kind of refining things, improving things. But this was all brand new. Can you imagine real quick being the first person to drive the first car? How scary that would be. Or even to be the Wright brothers, the first person to fly. You know, advances like this, the car and the plane, basically made transportation enormous. Trains were kind of becoming obsolete. You could now, instead of relying on horses and buggies, going across the country and taking months to get across, you can now go in weeks. With planes, especially modern day, you could fly from New York to San Francisco in a couple of hours.
It would kind of be different with being the Wright brothers and flying the plane because they knew how it worked because they made it.
They knew how it worked, but they didn't know if it would work.
True.
My point with all this is new technology that was coming out right at the 20th century, some new things. And this is all going to be very important and instrumental in the future, especially talking about World War I that I'm going to talk about next week, you know. Now, I'm kind of wrapping this up, and this has been kind of a short class, but all these technologies has been given birth to the new modern world. You know, we've had, as I said, industrialism being grown. You now have transportation improvements, you have communication improvements, and you have more science and technology coming out. For the first time in the world, you have lights that aren't fire, literally. So, again, talking about one thing, and I'm going to wrap it up here. People were working more. Working more, meaning more income. More income, they can afford to buy things. In addition to being able to buy things, they had leisure, had time to go out and enjoy things more instead of have to work from sun up to sundown. So you had new things, new life and leisure. People wanted to find things to go do. One of the most famous things that came out of this time was baseball. Baseball was invented by a Union general in the Civil War, a guy named Doubleday. And the first game of baseball was played in 1860s during the Civil War. The first professional baseball team was the Cincinnati Redlegs, now the Cincinnati Reds. That's why every April, at the beginning of baseball season, the Reds still hold opening day. The Major League Baseball actually didn't get founded until 1903. They had two competing leagues. Originally, they just had one, the National League. Now you have the National League and the American League. You know, baseball tickets were kind of cheap at the time, and people could go, work all day, get their paycheck, go and watch the ball game in the evening. And this kind of led to a golden era in American time. I mean, I'm sure all of you guys have heard this. Nothing's more American than baseball, mom, and apple pie. So, that's really all I've got for today. Like I said, it's kind of been a short class. I kind of want it to be a little bit of a short class because you guys coming back from break. I could take a few questions. I don't know if I have all the answers with this, and I did have to look up some stuff, but I'm sure you guys probably can go out and look up some of the things yourself. If you want to know more about Rockefeller or Carnegie or Marconi or any of the people I talked about, you guys can look it up. You guys can come up to me next week too and tell me anything you find that you found interesting if you want. Does anyone have any questions?
Who did you say baseball was created by?
General Doubleday was his name. I do not have his first name off the top of my head.
You know, it's interesting, all those men, you know, were all there basically at the same time. And I wonder what their wealth is, if you would have combined all their wealth.